All right, well, I think it's about time we get started. I've seen the attendees kind of level off. So again, thank you everyone for joining. In this webinar, we're going to be covering some advanced sketching topics in Fusion 360. I am the only one. I'm running the webinar and answering all the questions. So if you have any questions, you can leave them in the questions section in the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side. I'm going to do my best to get to them throughout the webinar, but if it's something broad or general, if you could save it towards the end, that would be great. That way we can get through all the content in time. So let me switch over to our PowerPoint. So I wanted to quickly review what we're going to be going over today. So sketching is a pretty broad topic in Fusion 360, and it's really at the heart of everything that you do. Every extrusion, revolve, loft, everything really relies on sketches. And it's important to really have both the fundamentals down as well as some advanced topics. So today we're going to be covering sketching fundamentals, best practices, common workflows, constraints and dimensions. So what's the difference between a constraint or a dimension? How do they work? What's the best process to use them? Sketch references. So how do I reference geometry that might be outside of my current sketch? And then we're going to be taking a look for the bulk of this webinar at some advanced tools. So you've probably seen the basic tools like 2-point rectangle and circle and all these constraints that are fairly straightforward, but I wanted to cover some more advanced workflows that might be a little bit tricky to figure out how to go through them. And then lastly, I have some pro tips, I guess productivity tips, some quick tips that help you speed up your workflows, and those are going to be at the very end. So we can start things off just quickly making some definitions because I'm going to be referring to these terms throughout the webinar, so it's good to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what's inside of a sketch? So in Fusion 360, there's mainly three things going on in a sketch. You have your geometry, and those are the shapes that you're drawing inside of your sketch. These are made up of sketch curves, sketch points, and when you connect these curves, they create profiles. So those are the three terms to keep in mind as we go through this. In addition to geometry, we have constraints, and you can think about constraints as simply rules that are applied that really relate the geometry to each other inside of a sketch. So constraints examples might be parallel, coincident, concentric, pretty much rules that define how certain sketch geometry can move and how it cannot move. And then lastly, we have dimensions, which really just set the sizing of sketch elements. This might be how large is your circle, how far apart are two circles, how long is your line, what is the angle, those sorts of things. And I actually put them in this order because this is typically the order that we're going to be problem solving in the sketch workspace inside of Fusion. You're typically going to be drawing your sketch geometry, then using constraints to eliminate degrees of freedom and really make sure that the sketch geometry will adapt in the way that you expect. And then finally use dimensions to lock in those values that you have, maybe for sizes or distances or something like that. And it's important that you properly constrain everything ahead of time so that when you add a dimension, it behaves the way that you expect. So that being said, I wanted to cover a simple example of this part that I have here on the right-hand side. It looks like a simple part. It is, what it's going to cover is creating geometry, constraints, dimensions, the whole concept of degrees of freedom, and then some other tools in the sketch palette such as mirror, trim, project, some fairly straightforward things. I know this isn't the most advanced example, but I wanted to make sure that we could cover this at the beginning. That way we have a nice fundamental before we get into the more complex geometry. So let me switch over to Fusion 360. So I have a blank design here, and everything that we're going to be doing today is essentially here in the sketch drop-down menu. So you see we have our sketch geometry that we can draw at the top here, simple things, lines, different types of rectangles, circles, arcs, the things that you would expect are up here. We also have these other tools down at the bottom that interact with sketch geometry. So instead of creating them, these are tools I can interact with them and edit them. So for example, we can add fillets, trim, break, offset, really interacting with existing sketch geometry. And then down here we have the project/include section of the sketch menu, which really is some of the advanced capabilities. So taking a look at intersection, where do we use that? When is that common? What does this include 3D geometry button? How does that work? Projecting to a surface, it's a nice way to create some 3D curves, and we're going to show that at the end of this webinar. So that being said, let's go ahead and sketch out our sample part that we have. So like every sketch, I'm going to start by creating a sketch. And Fusion's going to ask me to select a plane or a planar face because I need a flat surface to draw on. It doesn't really matter for this example which plane I pick. I'm going to go ahead and pick this one right here. And we'll see that we're reoriented automatically to look straight down in plan view at this work plane. One thing that you also notice is I do have the sketch grid on, and this is something that's a personal preference. I might leave it on for this one. Typically, I have it off. I just like a little bit of a cleaner workspace, but it can be nice because you can snap to these grid markers in the origin and so forth. So let's get started by drawing a few circles that represent the main shape of the part that we want to make. If we look at it right here, we can see that it's made up of a few circles, maybe some tangent lines. So let's start drawing those. One thing that I would highly recommend that you have is under your preferences, under preview, if you check the box for this color sketch geometry based on constraint status, I highly recommend it. I have it on for this webinar. And what it does is it's a very easy way to visualize if sketch geometry is fully constrained or if it still has degrees of freedom. So I would recommend that you have that on. What I have also here, so I have my blank sketch. Let's start by drawing some circles. So under the sketch drop-down menu, I can go to circle. I'll choose center diameter circle. And one handy tip that I have is if you don't know what a command is wanting you to do, just stop moving the mouse. It'll tell you place a center point. So the center point, I'm going to position this on the origin. It's just general best practice is if something can be centered on the origin, why not? So I'm going to click once to place it on the origin, and as you can see, I can move my mouse out to create a circle at the dimension that I want. If I have a dimension in mind, I can type that in right now. I don't, so I'm just going to click. You'll see that it creates the circle, and it's drawn here in blue, indicating that it still has at least 1 degree of freedom. And one way that you can test these degrees of freedom is by clicking and dragging on the geometry. The center of the circle is fixed on the origin, so that's not going to move. But you'll see that if I click and drag on the outer perimeter of this circle, I can move that around. And that's why it's telling me that it's not fully constrained, because it's still able to change its diameter. So next I'll draw another circle. So from the sketch drop-down menu, I'll choose center diameter circle. And I'm going to place this somewhere over here at an arbitrary diameter. What I'm actually going to do is turn off the sketch grid. I just like having a clean workspace like this, and we can jump into it. So what we can do now is make sure that these points are horizontal from each other, or we can start adding in some constraints, because as you can see, this circle can move anywhere that it likes, and it can have any diameter. I really want these to be horizontal, so we can apply our first constraint between these. So we have our constraints here on the right-hand side. So what I can do is select the constraint that I'd like to apply, for example, horizontal/vertical, and pick the 2 pieces of geometry that I'd like to constrain. You'll see that the horizontal/vertical constraint appears, and now I can drag this around to any position, but it's not going to let me move it up or down. Again, I can drag on this to change its size, and that looks good to me. So next I'll draw some lines because I want to have tangent lines connecting these circles. So I'll choose the line tool. And often what I'll do is draw something rather arbitrary and then constrain it in the way that I want. So I'll draw that line. It adds my coincident constraints, which means that the end point of this line lives on the perimeter of this circle. You'll see I can drag it around and it obeys that rule that I have set up. But let's make this tangent. Again, to do that, I can choose tangent, select my line, select my circle, select my line, select my circle. And you'll see that I don't have to go back and choose the tangent command again. It will go ahead and do that for me. So I still have some degrees of freedom. I want to show a quick tip on how to draw another line that's tangent without even having to go to the sketch palette. Again, I can choose line, and if I click and drag, click and hold on the circle, you'll see that it automatically adds this tangent constraint. And if I hover over here, I get another tangent constraint. So there we go. We have our 2 lines that are tangent to our circles. Now that I have, a relatively constrained model here, you'll see that it still has some degrees of freedom. Maybe we can start locking some of these down with dimensions. So let's dimension. How about the diameter of this circle and this one? So to do that, under the sketch drop-down menu, I'll choose sketch dimension. I'll select this diameter. Let's type in 150 millimeters. And for this one, how about 80? You'll see that this circle turned black, indicating that it's fully defined because we have its position and diameter locked in, so it can't change unless we change this diameter dimension over here. Now I can still move this around. What I can also do is now specify how about the center distance between these. Again, under sketch, I'll choose sketch dimension, select my 2 points, and let's set this to be, how about 200? That looks good. So now I have a fully constrained sketch because you'll see that all of the sketch lines are black, and I have a few more circles that I need to draw. So I have one circle here for a cutout, So again, I can choose center diameter circle or hit C for the hotkey for center diameter circle. I'll center it on this point right here, and I'll draw it out. We'll see that it's blue, being that it still has at least 1 degree of freedom. Let's eliminate that degree of freedom by defining the distance between this outer circle and this inner one. So again, I can press D on the keyboard to start the sketch dimension tool. I'll click on my 2 lines, and I'll specify that this distance is 10 millimeters. So our sketch is almost done. I want to actually draw some lines over here. So I'll start the line command. I'll start it over here, and as I move across, I'll add a coincident constraint here to this inner circle, and we'll see that we also have a horizontal constraint. So this line is horizontal, and its other end is coincident with the inner circle right here. I'll draw another line down. We'll have a perpendicular constraint, and now I can draw it horizontal and coincident with that inner circle. So it's still relatively undefined here, so let's try to lock it in. One thing that I might want to do is make sure that these 2 lines are symmetric about this center line of my part. And I don't have that center line already, so let's draw it in. To do that, I'll choose the line tool, select on this center point and this one, and we've drawn our line. And we can use this as a center line, but you'll see that it does interfere with the profiles because it is a normal sketch line. To turn it into a piece of construction geometry or a construction line, I can select it. I can choose normal/construction here in the sketch palette, or I can right-click and choose normal/construction. We'll see that now it's dotted, so I'm really just referencing it, and it's not getting in the way of any sketch profiles. So now if I want to make these symmetric, I could choose my symmetric constraint. And again, if you stop moving the mouse, it tells you select sketch objects or change constraint type. So I'll choose my sketch objects. So how about these 2? And now it's asking me to select a symmetry line, and that's going to be this center line right here. So you'll see that now if I drag this around, everything stays symmetric that way. That looks great. And I'll go ahead and draw in one more line, starting up here, horizontal to this inner circle. And instead of using symmetric, there's another way I could do this. I could mirror this line about that center line. So to do that, under the sketch drop-down menu, I can choose mirror. For the objects, I'll choose this one. And for my mirror line, I'll choose this center line. Essentially the same thing, just a couple different ways you can go about it. This is still relatively undefined. I can actually dimension the distance between these 2 lines right here. So I'll see that as I move them, they adapt to stay mirrored about this center line. But what if I want the dimension between them to be something like 4 millimeters? I can choose a sketch dimension tool and pick these 2 lines and set this to be 4 millimeters. Now we have this small gap. And I can drag this corner in until it's somewhere that I like. Maybe this isn't a sketch dimension that I know or that I want to define. I can leave it undefined right now and define it later, or keep it like this where I can drag it around as I see fit. So that looks really good to me. The only thing that's left is to use a tool like trim to remove the excess profiles that we don't need. This is not a necessary step, but some people like having cleaner sketch profiles. So to do this, under the sketch drop-down menu, I'll choose trim, and we'll see that I can trim away this excess part of that circle, as well as this one. And now I can come in here and remove these extra bits here. So I'll remove this one, and that, and then I can clean these up as well. So let me again choose trim and get rid of those. So now we have a nice looking sketch here. One thing that you might want to change is we do still have these diameter dimensions here, which made a little bit more sense when these were circles. So if we'd rather have those as radii, you can select it and right click and choose toggle radius. And now we have a radius dimension there. So by default in Fusion, when you create a circle, it's going to use a diameter dimension, and when you create an arc, it's going to create a radius dimension. And this is a way that you can toggle between the 2. So that looks good, so I'll hit Stop Sketch. This is a sketching webinar, so we're not going to do too much in the model workspace, so I'm just going to simply extrude this profile up. How about by 25? Maybe a little bit more, how about 40? There we go. And we'll see that we have our part. What if we wanted to have, if we switch to the presentation, we'll see that there is a hole running through the center here. So if we wanted to add that, how do we go about doing it? Simple way is I can create a new sketch on this work plane, and I can choose the center diameter circle tool here, and it looks like I could draw it. I can eyeball it in the center, but more often than not, eyeballing it's not good enough. It should kind of give you an uneasy feeling, and you should feel like, yeah, there's a better way to do this. So how about before we draw the circle, if we project in this face into our current sketch? And to make it a little bit clearer, what project does is I'm going to turn on the sketch grid so you can see the grid that we're sketching on. And to project this face in, it's going to actually be a rectangle. Under the sketch drop-down menu, I can go to project/include and choose project. And I have two options. I can project in an entire body, which is just going to give me pretty much the cross-section, or I can choose specified entities. And for that, I'll choose this face. And now this face is projected in. And as you can see, this curved face is projected into my current sketch, really just as a rectangle. So that looks good to me. I'm going to draw a construction line from midpoint to midpoint. And I'll turn it into a construction line by selecting it and choosing normal/construction. And now I could draw a center diameter circle, how about centered on that construction line? And that triangle right there is the indicator telling me that it's a midpoint constraint on that line. So I can draw my circle, how about 25 millimeters? I'll stop my sketch, and I can extrude this out. I can cut through, and I can cut through all of the material. So there's our sample part that really shows what you can do with just simple constraints, dimensions, and the workflow for really drawing the geometry, using constraints to set up the rules that you need, and then using the sketch dimension tool to really define those distances and those dimensions of your sketch. One thing that I like to show is that if we wanted to change this, maybe we wanted to change this profile over here, we don't actually have to jump back into the sketch in the timeline and choose edit. One nice little trick is that if I turn on the visibility of sketch 1, and I have some sketch curves that still have at least 1 degree of freedom, for example, these corners, I can drag them around to do some more dynamic changes. So if this is something that maybe you don't know the dimension, maybe it's in context of something else, you can drag these around and change the geometry outside of the sketch without having to right-click and choose Edit Sketch. You can do that outside of it, and it's really nice for making quick changes. So that was a simple example. I know we have about 40 minutes left, and I have a lot that I want to get through, so we can jump to some more advanced topics. Hopefully this is nothing new. This is just kind of the fundamentals of sketching in Fusion. And we can now look at something a little bit more complex. So we're making a little bit of a jump here. What if we wanted to use a tool like Intersect? When is a tool like Intersect useful, and how does it work? So this is a shape. This was just an example where I made a complex curvy shape and wanted to see how do I grab the intersection of a plane and that curved shape, and then use that intersection for a path for a sweep or something like that. So I can switch to Fusion, and I have this intersect example here. So you'll see that we have this complex shape. It's tapered, it is curved on the top and the bottom and all sides, nothing that is really convenient. So if I wanted to maybe find the intersection of a plane here and the curved body, it's going to be a lot easier to do that than to sketch around a spline that matches the outer profile of this. So what I have is a construction plane that I've created here, and as you can see, it intersects our part. And what the intersect tool in the sketch drop-down menu does is going to leave me with the intersection of this work plane and this body. So let's see how it works. To do that, I'll first create a sketch on my work plane. And we'll see here that our sketch grid shows where this intersection is going to happen. And what I can do now is under the sketch drop-down menu, under project/include, I can choose intersect. And again, I have similar options. I can choose specific entities that I'd like to find the intersection of, or I can choose bodies to find the intersection of an entire solid body and really just find its cross section at the work plane that I'm working on. So I'll choose that and I'll select this body, and as you'll see, this intersection is projected into my current sketch. So there we have it. So what's an example of something you might want to do? What if we wanted to run a circular cut along this path and perform a sweep all the way around using this intersection profile as the path and a circle as a profile? So we'll walk through the quick steps to do that. We're actually done with this sketch. All that we'd have to do is create a sketch somewhere on a plane perpendicular to this path and then sweep it across. And I'm going to show how to create that and make sure that it's perpendicular because it is a little bit tricky. So to do that, under the construct menu, I'll choose plane along path. I'll choose my path to be this intersection curve. And as you can see, I can drag this around and choose any position on this curve, and it's going to create a work plane that is normal to that curve. So it doesn't really matter at all where I place this. I'm just going to choose somewhere that looks nice. I'll hit OK. And now I can create a sketch on this work plane. And we can see that we're working now on this plane. And one thing that would be nice is to project in maybe the intersection of this curve with our current work plane. So to do that, under the sketch drop-down menu, I can choose project and maybe intersect. And for the entities, I can choose this path right here. And it may not look like it did much, but really I'm finding the intersection of this curve with my current work plane, similar to what we did in the first step. So if I hide this and hide our initial sketch, you'll see that it leaves me at this point. It's actually really close to the origin. That was fairly accidental. So to do that, I can choose a circle, and I'll draw it here. How about 8 millimeters? And you'll see that I have this circle that is centered on this curve, and now I can run this through for a sweep. So I can stop my sketch, show body 1, and under the create menu I can do sweep, choose my profile, and my path is going to be this curve right here. And now I've performed that sort of center cutout all the way around the intersection. So you can see how we use the intersect tool twice there. Once to create a path that is an intersection of a work plane and a body, using the bodies filter, if you will, on the intersection tool. And then we were able to use the intersect tool again to find the intersection of that path as well as the work plane that I was working on to create that point. So there's an example of using the intersect tool, something that's a little bit trickier. We can go back to the slides, take a look at what we have next. This is one that I find really useful. It's for creating 3D curves without really having to sketch them in 3D. What you're using is the project to surface command in Fusion 360 to project a curve onto an existing face. And it creates some really nice 3D curves that you can use for something like a pipe command or a loft or a sweep. And I'll show you in a few steps how we can create a pattern like this on something like maybe a handle grip or something like that. So to do that, let me switch to the part. So we have here this bike handle grip that we want to add this pattern to. One thing that I did ahead of time is I created a work plane up here. I sketched on that plane and I just simply sketched this spline. Nothing fancy. You'll see that it is just a 2D sketch. From the side, it looks like a flat line. So what I want to do now is project this spline down onto this existing surface. So to do that, under the sketch menu, under project/include, I can choose project to surface. It's going to need me to choose a plane or planar face, and this is going to be the default direction that it's going to project from, pretty much normal to the work plane that you choose. So I'll choose this plane. It's going to ask me to first select faces, and for the face, I'm just going to select this face right here. For the curves, I'll select this curve that we have sort of above the surface. And you'll see that with the project type set to closest point, it'll project a curve onto the face that you select, really looking at this curve and projecting on the closest point that it possibly can. That looks good, but what might be better is if we sort of want to drape this along, and to do that, I can choose along vector. It chose the right direction already, but I can also choose a project direction. So maybe I'll choose this vertical work axis. And now we can see that if we look at it from the top, it matches that profile exactly, and it sort of drapes it down top to bottom along that surface. So I'll hit OK, and I'll hide, how about sketch 14 at the top, and I'll stop my sketch. So we now have this nice 3D curve that we can work with on our existing surface. You can imagine how hard it would be to draw this if we couldn't project it to a surface. I can imagine trying to draw a curve that followed this unique profile and always maintain continuity on this existing surface. So now I'll walk through the steps. Again, this is more about sketching than anything else, but I wanted to show the steps to create this cutout because it is a little bit unique and a little bit tricky. So to do that, I could use something like the pipe tool. One thing that you'll see is that if I choose pipe and I zoom in, I don't really have the end conditions that I need because this curve is not flush with this surface. The plane that's normal to this curve at the end does not match up with this plane, so we have some kind of nasty end conditions here. So pipe isn't necessarily what we want. So what I do want is actually the end conditions here. If we were to imagine sweeping a circle along this path, is I want that circle to be flush with this face at both ends and to follow this path. So to do that, I'll first create a sketch on this face. I'll look at it from a 3D view, and I'm going to go ahead and project in this endpoint of my 3D curve. And now I can snap to that with something like a center diameter circle. So I can draw my circle, how about at 1 millimeter in diameter, and I have that. If I want this curve to be a construction line, I can do that so it doesn't get in the way of any profiles. I'll stop my sketch, and then we're going to do the same thing at the other end. So again, I'll create a new sketch on this existing face. Using the project tool, I can project in the endpoint of this 3D curve, draw another circle at 1 millimeter, and lastly, I'll turn this into a construction line. So we have 3 sketches here. We have this curve, which is really going to be the center line for this, as well as 2 profiles that represent the end condition that I want. So now, sweep isn't exactly what I want. What I really want is loft. So from the Create drop-down menu, I'll choose Loft, and I'll choose first this profile. And for my second profile, it's going to be this one over here. And you'll see that Fusion says, sure, I can loft between those. It's just going to be a straight line. Makes sense. But we can add in here some sort of rail or center line. So I'll choose center line. And the center line that I want this loft to follow is this 3D curve that we just created. I want the operation to be a cut. And now we can see that it has, the end conditions that we need. It's nice and flush on both sides. And it follows this 3D curve. So lastly, to finish this up, what I could do is maybe add a nice little fillet on these 2 edges, just round it off a little bit. And now if I wanted to pattern those 2 features around this cylindrical face, under Create, I can choose Pattern and Circular Pattern. For the objects, I'll have my sort of filter set to features and choose the loft and the fillet features. And for the axis, I can choose any work axis, or I can choose any cylindrical face and it'll find its central axis for me. And for the quantity, really up to you. How about 18? I'll hit OK. Fusion is going to take a minute to calculate this. It's kind of a lot that we're asking. We're asking it to do a 2-point loft with a center line 18 times around the cylindrical face. Oh, and add fillets to every edge that you see there. So that's how we can use the Project to Surface tool to create a nice 3D curve that we need that would be really hard to draw, and then create some interesting features here around this cylindrical face. If I wanted to change the number of instances in this pattern, I could simply right-click on this feature and choose Edit Feature. So it looks good to me. I'm going to take a second here to see if we have any questions. I don't think we do, so I'm going to keep moving on. Thank you for saving your questions for the end, or I guess no one has any questions. So that was the bike grip. And the last example here that I wanted to show is a little bit more about 3D splines. Sketching in 3D is always tricky. I think it's always going to be tricky as long as we're sketching 3-dimensional things on a 2-dimensional laptop screen, if you will, or 2-dimensional surfaces. So I can show you how 3D sketching works inside of Fusion 360. So let me switch over to Fusion. I'll make a new design. And a quick example, let me see if there's a question here. Okay, I guess everything's going well. I'll go ahead and create a new sketch on this bottom face. And if I choose a spline, I'll go ahead and draw, how about a 4-point spline like that. You'll see that this is perfectly flat on this plane. To enable 3D sketching under your preferences and in design, make sure that you have the Allow 3D sketching of lines and splines checked. So one way that we can create a 3D spline is by sketching it and then using the Move command to move one of these control points up or down. So let me switch this to Sketch, choose my control point, and now I can move this up or down, and you can see that I can create this 3D spline that way. This is one way to create them in Fusion. Another way that we can do it is by using the Include 3D Geometry tool. So let me exit out of this design, make a new one. And let's go ahead and start by sketching out a few 2-point rectangles. So to do that, I can hit the R hotkey. So let's draw one here. And how about another one right over here? And you'll see that the size of these doesn't really matter. It's more for an exercise. So I'll stop my sketch, and I have these 2 rectangles here. I can extrude this one, how about 75 millimeters up? And I'll sketch the other one, something less. How about 40? So you'll see here that we have these two rectangles. I can drag these points around and do some live editing to kind of inch them around if I like. But what if we wanted to draw some 3D splines that maybe connected each of these individual corners and were tangent to these edges at each of those corners? So it's something that would be traditionally just hard to draw, hard to imagine how you would draw it. And this is really where include 3D geometry comes into play. So to do this, under the sketch menu, I'll create a new sketch. And really the sketch plane that you create this on is rather arbitrary because you are creating a 3D curve at the end of the day. So I'll choose this plane. Again, it doesn't really matter. And what I can do now is, before I draw any splines, under the Project/Include menu, I'll choose Include 3D Geometry. And you'll see that I can select these two edges. And now these two edges are included in my sketch. So if I hide the bodies, you'll see that in 3D space I have these two edges. And this is the biggest difference between include and project. If I were to project these edges into my current sketch, what that's going to do is project them and everything is going to be planar on this face. I can even show you, we can take a look at what that might look like. So if I were to choose project instead of include and I choose these two edges, you'll see that it projects in to the sketch plane that I have right here. And it's now kind of taken it down to 2 dimensions instead of 3, and that's not what I want. So I'll undo that and make sure that I again did include 3D geometry, which is correct. And now what I can do is, with the spline tool, you'll see that it is on this work plane, but if I hover over this 3D point, it'll snap to it, and I can move it again onto this plane, or I can now snap to this point and hit the green check. And now I have this 2-point spline that is a 3D curve. The last thing I can do is make these tangent. So I can choose tangent, choose my curve, choose my 3D geometry, and again choose my curve and my 3D geometry. So now I have this 3D spline that is tangent to these lines that I've included in my sketch. And you can do this for all 4 things and create a really powerful kind of system here. So let me switch over to this one. So what you can see here that I have is, let me go back a few steps. So I did this for all 4. I have these curves here that are tangent to all of these. And what's really nice is that these undefined or underdefined rectangles that represent these extrusions, I can still move them around. So I can drag these curves around. So let me hide, how about these bodies? And what I can do is move these edges around. And you'll see that these 3D splines are adapting to everything that I do, which is really handy. What I can also do is I could perform maybe a loft. So let's see what that looks like. I already did this in the timeline, but I can walk through the steps here. So I can choose Create and Loft. And let's loft between this profile and this one. And it's trying to figure it out. And I can give it, actually, how about 4 rails? So I can pick this one, this one, this one, and this one. And it doesn't like something here, so let me actually go back to where we have it done. So there we have a loft between these 2 profiles using those 4 rails. And as you can see, I can adjust this around, and that loft is going to update really in real time as those sketches update. What's really nice is I can even tack on an additional feature. So you'll see here I added on a fillet, so I can hide these sketches. So now I'm lofting between these with 4 rails for the loft, and I've rounded all 4 corners, and I can still, in real time, drag these around and create some really complex 3D curves that are really being used to drive the loft here. And this is something that I think is really powerful and really shows off what you can do with 3D splines. And the key here is really using those 2-point splines, because with the 2 points and the tangent constraint, you're really guaranteed that you're going to have one smooth curve from one point to the other. So let me see if there are some questions here. I'll answer some quick ones. Yes, this recording is going to be available. We're recording it live right now. This is going to be on YouTube. And does it matter where that plane exists? That was 3 minutes ago. So I believe that was when we were creating these 3D splines. No, it does not matter where that plane is. Really, the reason why it's asking you to choose a plane is any command that is going to create sketch geometry, Fusion's going to want it to have a work plane that it lives on, even if the curves are in 3D. So that's why it's telling you to pick a plane. If it didn't have a work plane to work on, Fusion's not going to like it too much. It needs a work plane for reference. But unlike the project to surface command, that doesn't have any effect over that 3D spline at all. So I think that's all the questions that I see right now that are at least super relevant to what I just showed. I'm going to save some time for the end. So that is creating 3D splines in Fusion, and we have 20 minutes, and I have a few more things I wanted to show, some quick pro tips, either professional or productivity, whatever you wish. And I wanted to show some quick things here. So first, what I want to show is how to break a projected link. So let me go back to Fusion, and I can actually go to this example. And what you'll see is that currently in Sketch 2, I've projected in this geometry. So if this extrusion were to change, and I were to move this up, that projection changes, and because this circle is defined to be on the midpoint of this curve, it stays in the middle. This is, I can think 90% of the time what you want. You'd like it to update with these, but what if you no longer want this to be linked? So what you can do is in your sketch where you have that projection going on, what you can do is you can select the curves. So I'm going to choose all this projected geometry, and you can right click and choose break link, and now it's just some underdefined geometry. So now if I were to go back and change this extrusion, you'll see that that projection does not update. Probably not what you want, but some people do ask, maybe I've projected something in and I don't want it to update anymore, I just want it to grab a center point. That is how you can break the link of that projection. So let's run through these. So we did that. How do we add a spline point? This is one that I get a lot. So if I go to a new document and I create a sketch, what I can do is I'll draw a spline. So let's say we have a 3-point spline here. And what if I really wanted to add an additional point in here? All you have to do is select the line, right click, and choose Insert Spline Fit Point. And now you'll have this crosshair show up and you can place as many spline points as you want. So I'll escape out of there. Now I've added 2 more control points, and I can drag those around to any position that I like. If you want, you can delete them easily, and that's how you can drag them around and adjust them. So again, you choose the spline, right click, and choose Insert Spline Fit Point. Let me see if we do have some questions in here. I'm going to try to get to these to the end, I think. A few more things to run through. So you can easily, the other thing is clicking and holding to draw an arc. So to do that, what I can do is let's stop this sketch. If you find yourself drawing a lot of lines and you'd like to add in some arcs easily, you can do that with the line tool. So if I draw and I click, I drew one line, but if I actually click and hold and drag, now I can create an arc. So I could draw that, I can click again, and now I can hold and create another arc over here. This is a nice little segue into the next tip that I have, which is to use these constraints, you don't always have to go over here to the sketch palette on the right-hand side. What you can do is choose the sketch geometry that you'd like to constrain, and then right-click, and you'll be given a list of options here in the marking menu that you can use to constrain it. So these 2 points that I've selected, there's only 3 options. I can make them coincident, not really what I want here. I can fix them or unfix, or I can make them horizontal or vertical to one another. So that's the one that I want, so I can choose those and make those horizontal or vertical. I can choose these and again choose horizontal/vertical. And this is a nice and quick way to do it because any lines that you choose, you're only going to be given the constraints that make sense, and you'll see that these match up with the ones that are not grayed out here on the right-hand side in the sketch palette. So that's a quick little time-saving tip right there. So that was everything that I had as far as these quick productivity tips, and then what I have lastly are some resources for everyone before I get into all the Q&A. So some resources for learning Fusion more. We have our YouTube channel. So if you go to youtube.com/Autodesk Fusion360, you can watch all sorts of videos from longer tutorials that we do to quick tips to webinars like these that are recorded and uploaded to YouTube. We have our Fusion 360 website, so autodesk.com/Fusion360, where we have our Learning Center. You'll see that over here, the left image here, where we have, again, tutorials, content on how each of the tools work, workflows, basic training, that sort of thing. And we also have our forums on the Autodesk Fusion 360 website. So the forums, great place to go if you have any questions and you want a quick answer. I can almost guarantee that you'll get an answer in less than 24 hours. We're really on top of the forums, and it's a great place to go with any questions. If you want to do anything on social media, maybe you want to tweet at us, you can tweet the Fusion 360 team at twitter.com/ADSKFusion360. And if you want to reach out to me directly, if you have questions for me or feedback or something that you'd like to see in a YouTube video, I'm always looking for content and listening to what you guys like to see. So if you want to tweet me or just stay connected, you can find me at Taylor_Stein. But that being said, I want to thank everyone for joining. I appreciate your time. Have a great day.